Good afternoon and welcome back to the Atlantic Council's IMF World Bank Week. My name is Ananya Kumar. I'm the Deputy Director of Future of Money at the Geoeconomic Center at the Atlantic Council. I'm here at our pop-up studios at the IMF headquarters with Colin Colter, who's the lead of the Future of Digital Public Infrastructure Working Group at the Atlantic Council. Colin, thank you for joining me today. Colin has a new paper out this week on global DPI models. And his paper talks about, different approaches that countries have taken. Estonia that has worked through what is a private sector model of DPI, as well as India that has a more sort of government-led model of DPI. Could you talk a little bit about what the opportunities and challenges are between the sort of public sector and private sector-led model, and how can we ensure that these partnerships and how countries are approaching these models can be sustainable?
Absolutely, and thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it. Also want to thank all the contributors and the interviewers and people who helped with this paper, and my co-author, Barbara Kotschwar, couldn't be here today. I think starting with the promises and challenges of DPI is really the right place to start. I mean, the promise is monumental. We're trying to recreate the global digital economy structured around the individual, right? So that the individual person can be an agent, a decisive ultimate agent on how they transact, how they identify, how they share data, their own data, who gets it for which purposes. The challenge, or one of the challenges right now, is that in order to get that level of kind of broad, cross-market, cross-ecosystem interoperability, governments have been building single rails along which everyone must transact. That has some challenges, some kind of technical. You're putting a lot of eggs in one basket, so to speak. What kind of redundancies do we have? What's downtime? What are we allocating for? How do we prepare for that? That's one. Two, there's a trust and governance layer of we are explicitly trying to increase the capacities of the state. One of the promises of DPI is that why don't we have government ministers who can build real digital products? So that's training, it's capabilities. And so that they don't have to rely on outside vendors, typically is one of the promises. But that's a bit of a double-edged sword because you're also increasing massively the capabilities of the state. So what safeguards are there,
Right.
what controls, what protections? Our paper looked at a couple of different countries, some kind of famous examples, and then cross-compared a bit of them. But I think that's probably a good place to start. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. And what you're talking about really is about centralization, which can create sort of risks on digital trust and privacy and surveillance and other issues that we've seen happen in real time. And then there's sort of a promise of decentralization as well that exists, and maybe not DPI models that have been fully rolled out in EMs, but there's a certain idea that it could happen. Your paper is also talking about the dichotomy between public and private sector involvement. Most DPI models are probably going to include aspects of both, well, as much as you can control the government's involvement. That's been the bigger challenge. And then the issue of sort of speed and security, scalability and security as we talk about in payments. How important are these factors when you're thinking about how can we make DPI models successful, and how can we make them replicable in many economies and not just big, large emerging markets? And how do countries decide what works for them?
Excellent question. One of the things the paper doesn't actually talk about as much, I think that's just as equally important to point out, is we don't talk too much about software.
Yeah.
So, so much of the DPI world is predicated on the emphasis of open source software to solve government goods and services, whether it's digital ID systems or crowdsourced satellite information capabilities, KYC capabilities, so that people can avoid vendor lock-in, is the fear. One of the challenges, though, is that it's not obvious, it's not sufficient to also be open, interoperable, in the very least open protocol, open architecture, and to therefore be a DPI system. And so what we looked at was really what's the end goal as a paper, as opposed to what is the construct of that actual software system. We very much would advise and want to emphasize the importance of focusing on what does this actually look like in practice, who can interoperate, what are the use cases, especially in payment systems. And then to your other question about what's replicability, oftentimes people start in the DPI world, they start with India. India's quite a famous example now in their banking system, their ID system, their digital payment system. But one of the things we really discovered when we dug into this kind of export of the India stack, is that India's a remarkably unique country,
Right.
That sounds like an obvious thing to say, but I
Yeah.
think it's really important to push. They're linguistically unique and diverse, geographically diverse, religiously diverse, really high levels of trust in government. I think that's hard to
Really
find.
young population that's very
Super
comfortable with
young, high
technology. Yeah.
capacity. So I'm a little wary of how much of the India
That's
stack
true.
will actually export. So one of our recommendations, one of the findings of this paper is that every country is going to start and has started in different places. Some start with ID systems,
Right.
some start with direct benefits transfers, some start with data exchange and verification systems. That's one. Two, we had the benefit of building on the work of groups like the DPI map, or David Porteous, the World Bank, who had essentially found that a lot of these projects have been around for a while.
Yeah.
We just didn't call them DPI.
Yeah.
So that's some new nomenclature, originally inaugurated in UNGA in 22, and then with the India Leaders Declaration in the G20 23. But some of this rhetoric we're also a little wary of, and this wasn't consensus for the paper, but one was the DPI stack, and two, or the India stack, and two was this idea, and you'll hear it a lot, we heard this a lot in our interviews, of build for a billion. You're talking about what's going to last, what makes something
Yeah.
really survive. We think that's absolutely the right mentality and completely the wrong method. We would urge people, leadership in countries around the world, global south, global north, to try their best to build small, launch and pilot, iterate
Right.
furiously. And so the answer to your question is, if we're solving discrete problems, user cases, each country's going to figure out what it is that they actually want and need, as opposed to building a large-scale infrastructure project, pushing it out on people, and then later coming in and doing safeguards.
Right. I mean, and that's sort of a distillation I largely agree with. I think what countries need to do is understand what their policy goals are and try to achieve them through different means. With DPI, it's going to look different for every economy. Every economy is going to have different needs as well. So those policy goals are going to look ultimately different. All right, my last question to you, and this is similar to the question I asked the last panel, which is that what is the one takeaway of your paper that you want your audience to get away with after reading it?
The big takeaway of the paper is we need more transparency. We have scheme systems, we talk a lot about payments in the paper, and we just don't know much about the rules, right? This is something that touches every aspect of the digital economy of a country. What's the voting share? Who's on which task force? What's the role of the central bank? Who has oversight? What is governance? That's one. And two is just data transparency. We really need to define success, like we were talking about early on, when we talk about build for a billing, what does that look like? Oftentimes we only get top line numbers, which is important, and we need total transaction volume, but I think there are open questions as to some of these. Do they serve rural people, women? Is this young, educated men in cities who are actually using this? And if we don't have good data, we won't be able to actually drive any of those conclusions. And the third part, and the big takeaway, is that trust is built. Right, and that gets back to the start small and iterate. Ideally, by doing that, we'll bridge two areas in DPI world in which there's a big gap, according to our research. The first is user design, and how do people actually use these products? And the second part is trust. And ideally, if we start small and build in feedback loops with civil society, with banks and mobile network operators, whoever's involved in these systems, then they can co-create with the government. And we can hopefully skirt around some of the bigger challenges of, oh, you've pushed this big product, what's the oversight, what's the rules, what's the safeguards. Going forward, what we need is transparency, and trust is built.
Great, thank you. So trust by design and transparency and continuous testing. Thank you, Colin, for joining us, and I want to thank again all the working group members and the co-leads and co-authors of all the working group papers. This event was in collaboration with our South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council, and this is it. We're really excited for the paper to come out. Thank you to the audience again for joining me, and we're going to have a whole slew of events for the rest of the week, so I'll see you again. Thank you.